Been a massive experiment for Kenya. They're a young democracy. Clearly the elections have taken place and we've seen some skirmishes, but it's a long way. The two parties, mainly the ODPM and the PNU, have actually shown that they can actually fight against one another, which is not a good practice. And ideally we would like to have seen the elections go out slightly smoother. It's created a lot of tension, and what you realise now is that a lot of people who have been deprived, people who do not see any hope in the economy, do not have any jobs, actually taking to the streets in frustration at the fact that the elections have not been determined specifically. The leaders have been in politics for decades, and what they bring to the table is nothing new. But what we have is Mr. Odinga has actually been able to rebrand himself after only last elections actually supporting Mr. Kibaki, promoting him to the extent that he won the elections. But now those elections actually were the means by which he was able to propel himself to the public and able to sell himself that much further this time round. But I think they're bringing nothing new to the table. Both parties, in fact, all three parties, if you realise, are actually new parties who've only actually been around for the last 3 years. And of course, these politicians have been around for so long. And it's just a rebranding of the same message. And I think the local people are not impressed by this. They've actually come out in their masses to vote, which has been excellent. But in principle, the reasons why we're seeing the frustration in the streets is that people really do not really trust the politicians. They know that they're bringing nothing new. They're not going to alleviate their problems around poverty. They're not going to provide them with new jobs. Again, we may want to credit the current government with stabilizing the economy. But
are they really political parties, or are they fronts for gentlemen like Mr. Odinga, like Mr. Kenyatta, like Mr. Kibaki?
Well, you've only got to look at it. You've got all three parties have only just emerged over the last 3 years. You've got to ask yourself, who's funding them? Where they're getting the money from? And then it lends a hand again to corruption, because again, money's got to be coming out from somewhere, and someone's got to be living off it. So I think the whole Kenyan politics is very confusing, and the Kenyan public must be just as disillusioned as the politicians themselves. And of course, rightfully so. I'm so pleased to see that a third, if not 2/3, of the current government losing their seats, which is an indication that the Kenyans are not prepared to accept the politicians' message of old. And if you're going to actually come to the table this time, you've got to come with something fresh and vibrant. I think Mr. Olinda actually offers that. He's young, he's got a completely different message, he's rebranded himself quite well, but whether he can actually deliver on the day is yet to be questioned. I just can't see it.
A politics of sophistication, a democratic process, but really, which of the nuances, which of the finer points of democracy have really been observed in this election? By that I mean, has there really been a debate about the economy of Kenya? Has there been a debate about the political process in Kenya, about accountability, about corruption? Have these really been opened up and brought forward for debate amongst Kenyans?
No, I don't think so, because especially on corruption, Kenya is corrupt. It's been known to be corrupt. In fact, quite a few of those in government have been arrested and for corruption. In fact, £1 billion in aid between 2002 and 2005 has simply disappeared. Where is it? What's happened to it? And what you have in Kenya is that the politicians actually do what they want when they please. And of course, they've got no relationship with the masses, who are poor, disillusioned, and confused. And in terms of the population engaging with the politicians at times of election, yes, that's absolutely right. Now is the time for them to do so. But most of them don't understand what happens to the politicians after the elections. The politicians have no relationship with them. In fact, they do nothing for them, which is why poverty is a massive problem in Kenya, which is why there's huge inequality between rich and poor. The gap is so massive that the slums in Mombasa, it's terrible, terrible. And what you're seeing on the streets are people revolting, in fact demonstrating that they're probably not happy with any one of the parties and actually looking for a change. Why is it that we've got so many leaders within Kenya who are old, ailing, and why don't we have any youths coming through the process? And what's happened to that? So that's an indication that there's something wrong, that the youth that my learned colleague from the United States was talking about clearly are not engaging with the process, clearly are not part of the process, and the process, as far as I'm concerned, it needs to be looked at again.
Professor Nyang, no youth being engaged with, I mean, a damning indictment, really, not of what you had to say, but really of the process there in Kenya. Do you wish to maybe take back some of your optimism, or are you genuinely optimistic about democracy taking roots, poverty being eliminated, and the generality of Kenyan society engaging with politics?
No, I think I'm optimistic about the future for the Kenyans. I think the younger people in Kenya are very conscious of the fact that they have to deal with the question of ethnicity and not allow ethnicity to be used as a veil of lies by people who have political ambition. The second thing that is critical for the Kenyan electorate is that the Kenyan electorate recognize the fact that in this age of globalization, if they're going to make it, they have to have accountable leaders. And there are Kenyans who are willing to stick their neck for it.
Trading seems to have gone on. So many people seem to have jumped from one ship and onto another.
Well, it's all to do to hide the corruption, as far as I'm concerned, because the parties seem to be changing, everyone seems to be changing their hats. One minute they're with one party, the next minute they're with another, and you can only do that when you're trying to hide something, when you're trying to provide shadow for something else. And I'm of the opinion that the Kenyan politics is in trouble. The parties are not fully fledged and developed enough to be able to stand for these elections, as far as I'm concerned. And what you can find is that there's a lot of disarray and confusion. And the reasons for that could stem from the fact that Kenyan politics has only been around for, in terms of democratic elections, only 2 elections gone by so far. And only in 1963 they were under the umbrella of the British colony.
Ayo Johnson,
they've come a long way.
Ayo Johnson, you don't sound quite as enthusiastic or as optimistic as Professor Nyang. That pessimism, do you think that that could lead to a deterioration in the state of affairs inside Kenya, even civil unrest and violence?
Well, it can, because when you have a disillusioned public, when you have a public which is, I think 70 to 80% are under living in poverty, when you have about 60% to 70% that are illiterate, when you have massive inequalities, when you have access to education is a problem, or to the extent we may offer it to the government, because the government has offered a free primary education, but they've also said as part of the manifesto to offer free secondary education. Where are they going to get the money from? Who's going to pay for it? So when you look at all the problems within Kenya, and you think about where they're strategically placed as well, bordering Somalia and the Sudan, which are conflict areas in themselves, I think it lends a hand for us to actually need good leaders who can control the population, who can provide good leadership, and currently I'm not seeing that. I think it's engaged effectively with its neighbours. I think it's trying its best, but where it's falling down is issues around the border areas with Somalia and Sudan, where communities within those areas are half Kenyans and half the other countries that they form, and these communities feel victimised, especially the Muslims who live in those areas. And some of them have been arrested, some of them have been detained, and some of them have actually been taken to Ethiopia and then found themselves in Guantanamo Bay. And it's how the government currently is able to address that particular issue and address the issues of those communities. But in the wider context, I think Kenya are respected within the region. They hold a very pivotal role, and they're respected as seen as such. And of course, the Americans support them. Until we can stop tribalism, until we can stop nepotism, until we can actually stop all the various forms of inequality that exist in Kenya, where women do not have a voice, where they're suppressed, where they're invincible and their work is not recognized, where the community can actually galvanize and actually respect those who are actually in office, where those who are in office can actually deliver for the people, and hopefully over time we can see some change.